Let's now learn how to handle Keypress events. So right now we can already close the modal by clicking the close button and by clicking outside of the modal. But usually there is also a third way, and that's by hitting the escape key on the keyboard, right? And so this is actually a great use case to learn how to respond to keyboard events. So in order to listen for keyboard events, we still need to use add event listener, because the Keypress event is simply just another type of event. Now, keyboard events are so-called global events because they do not happen on one specific element. And for global events like keyboard events, we usually listen on the whole document. So let's close this terminal here. And now let's write document. So that's the same document that we use for query selector. And so basically it's a big object which contains a bunch of methods for all kinds of stuff. And that includes the add event listener method. So by using add event listener here on the document, we are basically listening for events everywhere. So no matter where they happen on the page, they will always trigger the event handler that we're going to specify here. All right. Now here about the name of the event itself, there are actually three types of events for the keyboard. There is the key down, the key press, or the key up. Key up, which is, so it's this one. This one only happens when we lift our finger off the keyboard, basically, or off the key. Key press is fired continuously as we keep our finger on a certain key. And key down is fired as soon as we just press down the key. And so usually that is the one that we use. Okay, so the name of this event is just key down, and this event will happen as soon as we hit any key on the keyboard. Okay, and then just like before, we specify a function here. And this time let's specify it here directly, so without creating a separate function. So function, and then the usual way, just like we have been doing. Now, as I just mentioned here, so this function here will actually be executed for any key press that happens. So let me prove that to you. And actually it will be hard to prove because you cannot see what key I'm pressing. But anyway, a key was pressed. And so now as I go to the console and just press any key, you see a key was pressed. And it doesn't matter which one. So Q, 3, P, enter, ESC, any key just renders here this same message. However, we only want to close the pop-up when the escape key was pressed. Okay, so that key in the top left corner which says ESC, right? So how will we know which key was actually pressed if this event here happens for all the keys? Well, the information about which key was pressed will be stored in the event that is going to occur as soon as any key is pressed. So remember, as I hit any key here on the keyboard, a key down event is generated, and our listener function here, so our handler function, is waiting for that event to happen. And anytime that an event like this occurs, JavaScript does in fact generate an object. And that object contains all the information about the event itself, and we can then actually access that object in the event handler function. All right, so again, when an event happened, we can have access to information about that event in the event handler function, just like this one. Now, up until this point, we have never looked at that event. We only just listened for it and then reacted to it, right? But this time, we actually need to look at the event object in order to figure out which key was pressed. And how can we do that? Well, what we need to do is to give this function here a parameter. And let's call it E, which stands for event. So we could also call it event, or we could call it X or Q, I, so it doesn't matter. But I like to call it E, which stands again for event. Okay, So then, as the event occurs, JavaScript will call this function with the event object as an argument. And once more, this works because we do not call this function here ourselves, right? We do not call the function, we only define it here. So we say, hey JavaScript, call this function when a key down event happens. And when you do so, please pass in the event object as an argument. Okay? And we will learn about the mechanics of this a bit better later. But it's probably still a good idea to already take notes of this stuff that I'm explaining. Anyway, now that you know why this function has access to an event, so to this E here, let's now actually take a look at it. So simply logging it to the console for now, and we can actually get rid of this one here. And now I will hit the Enter key. And so you see now we get this event, and it's called a keyboard event. It is just an object that is generated by JavaScript. So you see that here in the console, it actually looks like the objects that we generated ourselves previously. So with a key here and then a value. So a property and a value. And what matters here is basically the key, which, as I said, was enter. So I hit the enter key, and then this event was generated with the key property set to enter. So that's great information, because now when I hit the escape key, then you see that the key was now escape. Or I can of course hit any key. So this was the space key. So you see here, we have a space, or the Q, or Z, or Control, or Shift. And so whatever key you press, we now get this information about the event itself. And in this case, since it was a keyboard event, we get information about which key was pressed. So as you see, the information about the key, I was always getting it from this key property. So let's just log e.key, because remember we used dot and then the property name to read any property from an object. And so escape is now the key that I pressed, or enter, or shift, and so on and so forth. Great. And now that I know which key was actually pressed, I can use that information to actually close the modal whenever the escape key is pressed. So we can simply do if e.key triple equal escape. And then again, let's just log to the console to see if it works. Esc was pressed. And so now I can hit any key and nothing happens. Or actually, some stuff happens because we're still logging here the e.key, but the string that I just wrote here does not appear unless I hit the escape key. So now you see esc was pressed. All right. So that's of course not what we want, but instead we want to close the modal. However, I only want to close the modal when the modal is actually visible, right? And how do we know if the modal is currently visible? Well, if the modal contains the class hidden, it means that it's not visible. And so basically, when it does not contain the class hidden, it means that it's visible, and then that's the condition in which we want to close it. All right? And so we talked in the last lecture about adding and removing classes. But as I mentioned back then, we can also check if an element already has a certain class. And so now that becomes really handy, because now I can do this. So if the escape key is pressed, then we can now check if the modal contains the hidden class. So another if, so if modal and again dot class list and then dot contains, and then again the class name. So that's hidden in this case. So if the modal.className contains the hidden class, it means that the modal is currently hidden. And so in this condition, we actually don't want to do anything. we only want to close the modal if it does not contain the hidden class, right? And so here we can once more invert that Boolean value. All right, so this not here is very important, as you probably start to see. So let's read this again. If the modal does not contain the hidden class, then close the modal. And so how do we close the modal? Well, we can simply call this close modal function, right? So let's do that. Close modal. And here we do actually need to call this function, okay? Because when this function here is executing, so this one here, as it then reaches this line, of course, something needs to happen. And what needs to happen is basically this code. So we could just copy this code down here, but that's of course not what we want. Instead, we can simply use this function here again, and using means here to call it. So to execute the code that is in here, so this. So let's test this now, and then we can improve the code even a little bit. So we open it. Now I'm going to press just any key, let's say enter. So you see enter. And now as I hit the escape key, watch what happens. Yes, indeed, the modal is gone. Great. Let's see where this button clicked here comes from in line 9. Now that's of course because of this console.log. And let's get rid of this. Okay, let's try it again. Open it on this button. I hit any other key, nothing happens. I hit escape and it's gone. Great. Now let's read this code here a little bit. So basically this means if the pressed key is escape, and if the modal does not contain the hidden class, then execute this function to close the modal. Now notice how I just said if this and then if this. And so what I mean is that we can actually aggregate these two if statements together. And so this is the same as having just, and I'm cutting it here. So it's the same as having just this. Now we can get rid of this stuff here. And that's it. And so now it reads the exact same way as before. If the pressed key is escape, and if the modal does not contain the class of hidden, then close the modal. So give it another try, just to make sure. And yes, that works perfect. Beautiful. And with this, our modal is actually feature complete. It works exactly as our demo here. And so with this, we finished this very small second project. So once again, I hope you liked this one, and I hope you can start to see the power of DOM manipulation so that in the future you will be able to build anything you can imagine just with JavaScript. Now that is of course still a long way to go, but that's also why we have the next project, which is going to be a really nice project to basically train and reinforce most of the things that we already did in this project and the previous one. So the next project is going to be more like a practice project, but I still believe it's very important to do that project in case you have the time. And believe me, it's by far the most exciting thing we have done yet in this course. So I hope to see you there soon after you take a well-deserved break.